Let's start. So now we have Omar joining us as well. Hello and welcome. Let's start the class. So today we are going to look at some famous themes in studies. And I have picked our main theme today to be the Reti theme. And you probably know the famous Reti study, but there are other studies based on this theme with different piece configurations. So then there's a couple of other themes that I have picked. There's the Avalon theme, and then, trap bishop in the corner, or blocked by its own pawn. And then we can try to stop a bishop diagonal in clever ways. And then knight in the middle of the board dominates. Yeah. So let's get right into it. And let's start with the Reti theme. Just one moment. Here we go. Yeah, so you probably all know this example. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but that is the Reti theme. So the idea is black is promoting down here and white is promoting up here. And while the black king is in the square of the white pawn, then the white king is definitely not in the square of the black pawn. But the idea is, how can white draw this game? So you'll probably see it, but you can put it in the chat. What is the solution to this one? I thought you had seen it before. Yeah, you both got it. The king goes to e5. So here's the idea. We have to constantly keep out for two ways. So we have to either stop the pawn or support our own pawn. If we go too much to one side, let's say if white is just focused on stopping this pawn, then this is a dead end. This is of no use. So black will promote the pawn and stop white's pawn. So we have to try to stay in the middle. And so this is the Reti idea. And already now, white is actually threatening to support his pawn. So let's say if h3, then king e7. And this is a draw. And if king here, we are close enough to promote. Yep. So already after king f6, we're actually threatening to support our pawn. So king to b6. And now king e5, which threatens to support our pawn, but also threatening to stop the black pawn. So black has a choice of evils. This is a draw. Or if black runs with a pawn, then we are ready to support our own pawn. And this is a draw. So this is the Reti idea, to stay in the middle. So that has something to do with the geometry of the chessboard, of course, that let's say we want to stop the pawn on h2, ultimately on h1. And then to get to, it takes 7 moves, but if we go diagonally on the chessboard, it's also 7 moves. So the king can go across the board in many ways in the same number of moves. Okay, so let's move on. This was, this endgame is from 1921, and from 1928, he expanded on this idea. So you could say that this is the full study. So, and after king g6, we get many of the same ideas as in the original Reti study. So even though black has 3 pawns over here, white can use the same idea. Let's say, now we can move either of the pawn. And we get to the same position as we just saw before. So there's a little twist in these positions. And the little twist is that we can get in queen versus queen, where black is left with an extra pawn. But then according to opening endgame theory, it will still be a draw. So for instance, we could have a look at this line, and then we run with the f pawn. White still has to do the same, go to e5, and then we can get into this position where both players promote. But this extra pawn over here is not enough for black to win the game. So promotion square. So for white, it's always safer to hide in the opposite corner, diagonally opposite. But in this case, it's also possible to hide behind the pawn. So this is a draw, theoretically speaking. So it is possible to expand on the original study like this. So yeah, that's the Reti idea. Thinking about attack and defense at the same time. So there will be a few puzzles with the Reti idea. So let's move on to other ideas. No, actually, here's another one with the Reti idea. One that I didn't pick for the puzzles. So let's see. White to move and draw. And so here, the first move is to play c6. And then king b7. So if black now plays f5, what's the idea of stopping this? How can we stop this pawn from promoting on f1? So black's bishop is controlling d8, which is great, but it seems like white is not in time to catch that f pawn. So how can white do this? Yeah. Well, not via a6, because this pawn is still defending b5. We have to get to the square to win a tempo on the bishop. So it's king takes c6, and then king b5. Let's see if we play king a6. I believe black can play bishop d8 here. And now the white king is a little bit stuck. So king takes c6, and now king b5 wins a tempo. And bishop moves. And now we are in the square of the pawn because of that tempo. And this pawn is doomed. Or let's say if black tries to, then we have this pawn, and this is going to be a draw. Because black cannot keep defending that f4 pawn. So it's another idea of the Reti study. So okay, c6, c. Yeah, king b7 doesn't work. Yeah, so white simply has to go c6 here, but it also works. So let's move on. So here's a famous study. I don't know if you've seen this before, but it has a number of ideas in it that is quite interesting. First and foremost, the Avalon theme, which we will get to. So it's very important that there's a pawn here on a7. But this example is also good for other things. Next week, we're going to talk about studies that are based on fortresses. And this is actually a study like this, is a combination of the Avalon theme and then a number of fortresses based on these 2 pawns over here. So Trotsky, he has combined it in this brilliant study. So let's see how it goes. So how can we start out with white? It's white to move and win. Let's get some good ideas. Yeah, B7. So let me know if both of, do you know this study already? You can let me know. Okay, that's great. So you are in for a treat then. So, so B7 is the move, as you suggest, Omar. Okay, so let's see first why white could try D6, or white could try to take the pawn out. So let's look at those options first. I have seen even strong players this position take on A7, and it's based on a wrong calculation. So the idea is now the bishop defends this pawn, and now we can just go on with this D pawn. And then they play like this. But here black has a defense. And then black is actually winning. So what is it? Black to move and win. Yeah, you got it. Check. And then back here and black is winning. So that's kind of easy to miss because the king was on c4 here, and now it's gone, and now we can give the check and get back to the back rank. So b takes a7 for that reason doesn't work. Let's see why d6 doesn't work. So black can go ahead and take this pawn. Yep. And this is a fortress. So why is it a fortress? White can simply put the king on g8 or near the corner. And it's, yeah, so we don't need this pawn, doesn't matter. And in order to get to this pawn, white has to get that pawn if he wants to win. But by doing so, white is going to stalemate the black king. So this is a fortress. So white's mistake, you could say, is that this pawn went all the way to h6. So don't do that. There's some endgame positions where, so the moment this pawn is pushed to h6, we have all these fortress ideas. If the pawn was still on h5 here, let's say h4, so it cannot be attacked by the king, then it's a win for white, because the white king can get in and has an option of attacking h7. So, but this is a fortress, so black has to avoid that. So the first move is b7, and black has to defend against this pawn promoting. And now d6. So the way to defend here, this looks like a big problem for black, because white is going to promote this pawn, win the rook, and after that we are going to promote that pawn. So what to do about that? But there is a defense, and that is the Amelung theme. So Trotsky, he took it from Avalon, and then he combined it with this idea of a fortress on the other side of the board. we will see. So the idea is the following. We bring the king to a6, which is quite a nice idea. This idea has gone into many studies with all kinds of piece configuration. So it's quite a nice idea. So now white has a choice here. So we can promote the pawn, or we can try to, let's say, get the king forward before the black king gets down into the corner. So what do you think white should play here? Okay, so I call it the Avalon Theme because Amelung, he made a study where with only the pure idea, which we will see. So it was Trotsky who added these 2 pawns over here and made this study. Because of these 2 pawns, we have a lot of interesting extra stuff. So of course, the Avalon theme is, the pure one is that this is a stalemate. Same goes for if we take a rook. And then I have a suggestion here with taking a knight. And there is also king d3, or bringing the king forward and just giving up that pawn to get as fast as possible to h7. So these are our options. So, so there was a suggestion here in the chat, a knight promotion and king e3. So let's see king e3 first. The black takes the pawn, king moves forward. And I just need to get to, let's say, to f7. Then I am in the corner. So that's just what I need to do. And fortunately for me, I can win a tempo on that bishop by going to c8. And the thing is, if white can get this bishop on this diagonal, we would be able to control these 2 squares, and then we can bring the king forward, and the black king could not get into the corner. The problem is if bishop e7, then we win another tempo on that bishop. So basically, it's the same thing. And now we could even go to e8 here, because we will get to the f7 square now, or f8. So it doesn't really matter. And black is down in the corner, and it's a draw. So that doesn't work. White is simply not in time. So I think that's a nice little side point of the study, where this bishop is so clumsily played to get into this diagonal, that and black will actually win 2 tempos on it. So that's a nice little point. Okay, then let's go for knight promotion. And the original Amelung idea is that if you imagine these 2 pawns are not here, then black would have this final fork that wins one of the minor pieces. So there is no chance to keep both bishop and knight and checkmate the black king. So this is a draw. But of course, now we are not going to give up the knight now, because that's the fortress if the king gets to g8. We're going to keep the knight and take that pawn on h7. But black can actually draw this game by using the information of another fortress. So how to draw this with black? So what you need to know in this position is there's a difference if the pawn is on the 7th rank, on the 6th rank. If it's still on the 6th rank, if white can keep it here, and let's say get the knight behind the pawn. Yeah, so the defensive idea is to force white to play h7, and then we have a fortress. So white cannot be allowed to play this knight behind the pawn. Then the white king would simply grab this pawn and come back, and then white would be winning. So king e7, and then let's say king moves forward, and then after king f7 we have to jump back here, and here there's no other way to save the pawn. And with this pawn or not, this is a fortress, because the black king can just go back and forth. Of course, in this position, you have to make sure you get rid of the pawn, otherwise you will get stalemated and then checkmated. So don't make sure you don't have that extra pawn to your disadvantage. But otherwise, without this pawn, this is a well-known fortress, because white will stalemate the black king the moment steps on g6 or h6. So pawn on h7 is a fortress, pawn on h6 is still winning. So that is the idea. King e7 simply forces the pawn forward to h7, and we have a fortress. So what to do then in this position? We almost exhausted all our options. So what is the solution? So we have to go for the last option, which is we have to promote to a bishop. And two same-colored bishops. Trotsky, he made other studies like this. I might be able to present them in a later class. I'm not sure. Definitely not as a separate theme. It's going to be among other themes like art piece configuration or something like that, because it is rare. It's an oddity. It's kind of fun, yeah. So what is the point of doing two same-colored bishops? So the thing is, with two bishops, two of the same color, black does not have a fortress with the king on g8, because the two bishop controls two diagonals. That's the best way to look at it. So the bishops, you could say they control the same squares, but not quite, because we have two bishops. So we actually control two diagonals. And why is that important? It's important to control the f8 square later. So let's see. So something like this. So while I'm making moves here, you can try to see if you can find the winning idea. Well, say it doesn't really matter if black has that pawn or not. So let's just get rid of it. It's really not important. So what's the winning idea here? How can white win this position? So again, with only one bishop, we have a fortress. But with two bishops, it's no longer a fortress, which is a very nice idea by Trotsky. So how can we break down this fortress? So you can still look for the idea while I play a few moves. So after this check, of course, if the black king goes out, we can just go for the pawn. This is winning for white. We don't even have to sacrifice that bishop, but So black has to go to the corner. Mm-hmm. Yep. I totally get it. So if you only had one bishop, you could get this set up. And then you would hope black would go in the corner and then we have a checkmate, right? So that doesn't quite work with one bishop. But so black would simply defend like this. But with two bishops on two diagonals, we could just get to this position. And now we're forcing the black king into the corner. And so we actually have a mating attack going. So two bishop controls two diagonals. That's a much better way of to see it than just, two same colored bishops control the same squares, because actually they do not. There are too many dark squares on the board for only one bishop. So, but this is a great idea by Trotsky. There's so many different fortresses in this position, and he used the Avalon theme. Okay, so let's move on to this position. It was actually a position I put in the database from 2 weeks ago, which is king, bishop, and knight mates. So we didn't do the position, but there's a second idea in this puzzle, this study that I will use today. So here the problem for black is that, no, the problem for white is that the bishop is hanging, and also the knight is also hanging. So if white gets to keep all these four pieces, then there's a mating attack against the black king. But it looks like white will lose one of them. But then white has this idea of bishop d3. And if bishop takes here, we can play bishop a6. And we can hope for this mate, king to c8, and then bishop b7. And if black tries to get out, then we have a check here. And we can play knight e6. The knights are defending each other. White is winning this position. Okay, so bishop d3. Bishop takes, bishop a6. So this is slightly different, because in this position, black has counterplay with that d pawn. So any good ideas here? How white can try to win this? Yep, we can start with king g6 to get a tempo. Yep. And here's the problem. If the bishop doesn't have a lot of squares, so now we're talking about this idea of this pawn is actually, trapped. Black's bishop is being trapped because of that pawn, which is the bishop doesn't have a lot of squares. So white is not really in time to get to the c8 square. But if the bishop goes to f8, then suddenly we are in time. Because this doesn't work. Then we just stop the pawn. So here we get an extra tempo. Yeah. The question is, Omar, how do we do it? So let's see, in this position, bishop h6, now we are definitely in time to get to c8 because of that extra tempo. Okay. So how do we trap that bishop? Bishop has to go to h8. So how do we trap the bishop with king and knight? Because it is possible. This diagonal right now is only 4 squares long. So the knight could take 2, the king could take another 2 squares. So how do we make it work? So that is our second idea, is simply to trap that bishop, because this diagonal from e5 to h8 is simply too short. It's only 4 squares long. So the mating idea, king to c8, doesn't work because this pawn is too fast. And if king goes for the pawn, we can always put it here and protect it by the bishop from behind. And then the king is tied down to the pawn. There's no checkmate then. So how do we trap that bishop? So knight to d7 and king to h7. Okay, it's a good idea. Then the king would take these 2 squares and the knight would take these 2 squares. So that's a pretty good idea. But it's not possible to get it like that. So Matt, you have the right idea. So the idea is to get the knight to f7. And then, because the king is already controlling these 2 squares, and the knight on f7 would take the last 2. So how do we make this work? So if knight d8 now, I could play d3. And then I'm okay. I can get my bishop out. And if you try to trap my king, then again, my pawn will distract you and my king will get out of the corner. Yep, that's the idea. First play bishop d3. And now black is in a deadly Zugzwang. And the only move now is, so we need to get to f7 with tempo, right? Because if knight d8, then bishop e5. But now black's only move is king v7, and then we have a check. And then knight f7 traps the bishop. And then black has one last chance here, is trying to get the king to c3. But let's see. So this can easily be stopped in 2 ways. We can get our knight to e5 or king to e4. Yeah. Winning for white, or simply king here, and white is winning. So this is a great idea, this idea of trapping the bishop behind its own pawn. Okay, so let's move on to another theme. So here we are trying to stop this bishop from stopping our last pawn here. So with white, we want to make sure this pawn promotes. So this is white to move and win. There's a lot of puzzles like this where the knight jumps around and is tricky and protects some squares directly and other squares indirectly. And then in the end, white is able to promote that pawn and win. So we start out with knight to g3. There are many of these kinds of puzzles, and you have one of them among the 8 puzzles. There's another one. So this idea is, it's kind of a favorite idea among study composers. It's a nice idea. So let's see. Black has to somehow get into this diagonal. So right now, white is controlling these squares. So we have to try to get in here or here. So let's see, if bishop a4, Then white can block the diagonal like this. And then if bishop c2, then we have knight e3 check. So that doesn't work. So the main line is bishop b5. And how do we make it work now? So the black bishop doesn't go to the diagonal and stops the pawn. Mm-hmm. So knight e4, yeah. Maybe black tries f5 then. I assume you mean trying to get the bishop to f5 because f5, h6 is winning. So bishop d3 and knight f2 is the point. So bishop d7. So there's a lot of forks here. There's a fork there. Yeah, so the reason why we even consider bishop a4 is that the king is here on a light square. So we can actually allow the pawn get all the way here if we can take that knight with check. So, but there's knight c3 here, so it doesn't work. Then we have bishop d3, knight f2, f5, h6. So bishop d7 is our main move. And what do we do now? Let's see. So we have to control f5. So the move is knight to d6. So now we're also stopping the bishop from going to b5. The king takes c6. So here black only has bishop a4. And then what do we do now? Let's try knight c4. Does this work? Let's see about that. So knight f5 is supposed to be the main move. Same idea. If bishop c2, then we have knight e3 check. And yeah, so that's how it ends. So knight c4. Why is that different? Yep, I agree. King e2 here seems right. And now bishop c2 is coming up. And knight a3 looks to, now I can get this way to f5. So knight c4 is not correct. It has to be knight f5. Yep. And after this, there's no stopping the h pawn. Black can try something like bishop d7, but then we can give a check and then move the pawn forward. And we are promoting. Okay. So a lot of knight trickery. So let's try to move on. So let me know if you have seen this one before. It's another famous Reti study, but it's not our Reti theme from today. It's just a Reti study. So Matt, have you seen it before? Okay, great. So there are positions where, and we can learn something from that from Endgame Studies, where the knight in the middle of the board can sometimes control the entire board because it controls so many squares from the middle, and then there are all kinds of tricks. So it even happens in endgames. You have the knight around the middle of the board, and then suddenly it has a great influence. But this is such a case. And so we start out by doing knight d4 check. And what should black do then? So let's see, black has different strategies. So one is to maybe just go for this pawn. If that happens, then I believe white can just take this pawn out, and then we can place the knight behind our pawn, which is quite a good strategy. Now we are ready to sacrifice the knight because we have two passed pawns. Something like this. And now black needs to get the bishop in the game first, which is not so easy to get it to control a7 before we can try to target the knight. Because how do we get the bishop around? It's a little bit far off on the side there. So maybe white has to waste a lot of time doing this. And then once this happens, let's say, then there's two pawns is simply too many. Yeah, this is too much for the black bishop to handle. So these are typical endgames where two pawns is too much, and we can place a knight behind. So king b7. So bishop f4 first. That's a good idea. So I would probably move forward like this. And then king b7. So let's see. King g4. So the other line we just looked at, white was actually winning by a margin. I think we had two extra moves once we gave up one pawn to promote the other. We had two extra moves there. So the problem is where do you put the bishop now? If you try to get it back already, then you cannot even take the pawn because of knight c6. So I can play f4 here. There are all kinds of, maybe bishop d6 here to protect f8. That makes sense. And let's say this. But now we cannot get it to c5 right away. So let's see. So if this a6, the bishop has to go down here. And again, we have a situation, this is just too much for the bishop to handle two pawns. Yeah, and here we are at least two moves up. So even if the bishop was here and the king was there, then we could still sacrifice one of the pawns. So we have two moves to spare and we're still winning. Okay, so this idea doesn't work for black. So white always has this. So again, this is one of these endgame studies that are relevant for endgame theory. So if black tries that, we simply have time to pick up that black pawn, and with two extra pawns, we're winning the endgame. So black moves forward, We can also mention that a move like, yeah, king d5, then the pawn simply promotes. So king c5 is our main move. And what should white play here? Let's see, knight b3. That is a good idea. King b4, then a6, so I play king b5. Then I guess your idea is to take the pawn out now. Otherwise, I'll just play bishop f4. Yeah. So let's see this. Now the bishop f4 idea makes a lot of sense. While we can, before king g3, king moves forward. So let's see, let's get the move order right here. Maybe play the bishop back to b8 first. I think so. Let's say king g4. We play king b4. Now we're actually threatening the knight. If the knight moves, oh, the knight can go to d4. Tricky, tricky. I was wondering, is there a way to stop that? I can maybe go bishop a7 first because that hits the pawn and also controls the knight. And let's say after f4, I believe king b4. Let's see, f5, king takes. Oh, white is winning this. We could just sacrifice one of the pawns now. So where did this go wrong for black? A very good idea. Okay, so knight b3. Where did I lose that tempo? It's a good question. Bishop f4, king h3. King b4, knight d4. Let me just see here. Now I'm not sure. Let me just ask the engine. Bishop f4, okay. King g2. Bishop b8 is fine. Oh, not king g2. King h3. Bishop b8. Where did we go wrong here? King a4. Aha, and then there's no check. Was king b4 losing? No. After king knight d4, we can go back to c5, and it ends in the same. Okay. So we didn't have to waste a move with the bishop there. And after, yeah, now we are in time. It's because I thought we had to move the bishop, then we wasted a move. Let's see. Tagging the pawn, tagging the pawn. And no, of course not like that. But here, white is not in time. We can take this, and then we can stop that pawn. It was because I thought black needed to make a bishop move, so just one tempo short. As you might saw in the variation tree there, the move for white is king h1. Double exclamation mark. And it turns out that this bishop is has nowhere to go on the board. So that was another point behind having this pawn here on f2. Otherwise, bishop e3 might have been the only square. So after king h1, the black bishop has nowhere to go. And actually, the black king has nowhere to go too. So let's see. There and there and there and there. There's going to be a knight fork. If here and here, there's going to be another knight fork. And if the king moves, yeah, king d6 is a knight fork. King d5, then our pawn promotes. So this is actually just winning for white. And taking the pawn doesn't work because then black has a chance to get the bishop back. That should be in, oh, you know, yeah, check and take the knight. Yeah. So if the king takes here, then we give a check first, and then we take the knight. Maybe we can even take the knight first. I'm not sure. It might be okay to take the knight first, because here we have the check back to b8. And if king g3, we are in the square of that pawn. So it might not, the move order might not matter here. So let's see. So king h1 that's a very nice move. So, but in this puzzle, the knight controls the bishop, let's say, very directly. If the bishop goes to a square, then we immediately have a knight fork. In other studies, it can be more indirectly. Let's say we do something, and then king has to go somewhere, and then we have the knight fork. But not so much in this one, but still very nice. So let's see. Let's see. Yeah, that was the last puzzle I have to the presentation. So I guess you will have 5 more minutes to solve the puzzles. And then we'll just see each other at 3:30 back online. Okay? So see you soon again.